thesis was assessing the performance of ICE's elasmobranch harvest control rules using management strategy evaluation, and we did this with a case study of Raya clavata in the North Sea. So jumping straight into it, in 2012, ICES initiated a tier-based system for deciding on the management plans of species under their advice. This is a system structured on the availability of information, and it looks a bit like this. So in the first two categories, you have data-rich or data-moderate species, and then in categories 3 to 6, you have data-limited to data-poor, and this means that they lack sufficient information to conduct an analytical stock assessment. And the species today, Raya clavata, falls into category 3, which means the harvest control rule is based off trends in the survey of abundance, particularly the vulnerable abundance. So a bit of context, elasmobranch species are particularly prevalent in the data-limited categories. This is associated with difficulties in age reading, but also the fact they are often non-target, which means less data and less funding to collect new data. When you combine this with life history traits that make them more vulnerable to overexploitation and environmental pressures during the current climate crisis, this means there is a need to effectively and sustainably manage them. So to investigate how best to manage them, we looked at the case of Raya clavata in the North Sea. This is primarily a non-target species with high levels of discard and currently no species-specific management. And so we were looking at how can we ensure catches are sustainable without impacting the target species. To do this, we use management strategy evaluation. But what is that? It's a modeling-based approach aimed at testing the robustness of management plans to determine which perform the best to achieve specific objectives. And a modeling-based approach is useful here because you can't really go and test a bunch of management plans in the real world. The specific tool we used is the Data Limited Methods Toolkit developed by Carruthers and Hordijk, and it's a generic framework for MSE which can be adapted to specific cases. Okay, so the aims of this study were to assess the current ICES management plan against a range of alternatives, to produce recommendations on alternative methods of management for the stock, and to use sensitivity analysis to check the stability of management plans to error and potentially focus future data collection. So onto the methods. The first step was to set up the operating model. This is a highly parameterized model, and we were able to estimate 22 parameters within the study. A further 30 were taken from literature, and 6 time series were estimated as well. We defined the stock boundaries within the Greater North Sea ecoregion, highlighted here in yellow, and the observation model parameters were set to predefined bias setting. This was chosen because of data quality issues highlighted in the elasmobranch working group of ICES, and the fisheries dynamic was a single fleet. The stock dynamic was an age-structured, single-sex, two-area spatial population model, and the overall operating model was initiated with historic simulations starting in 1946 and running till 2018. Ideally, you want to start the historic simulations at the start of the fishery, but with the North Sea being exploited since the industrial era commercially, this really wasn't feasible with the data available. So 1946 was chosen because World War II gave the stock a bit of relief. The MSC itself was based on the best practice guidelines set out in PUNT 2016 and following the current process. So conceptual objectives were set for the fishery based on the pressure state response framework laid out by the FAO, and these were converted into operational or quantifiable metrics within the model. 34 management plans were selected based on available data, and each management plan was simulated over 2 base and 2 robustness scenarios. The 2 base scenarios were either Ricker or Beverton and Holt recruitment, and the 2 robustness scenarios were increasing or decreasing the error in the observation model. And this was projected forward for 50 years. To narrow down the list of MP, a minimum threshold of 50% was set for the operational metrics, and failure to reach this in 2 or more of the categories meant exclusion from further analysis. Trade-offs between management plans and groups were then assessed, and finally sensitivity analysis was conducted. Okay, so on to the results. So here we have a plot of the spawning biomass in the last 5 simulation years and the yield in the last 5 simulation years, and both are relative to the current, well, the 2018 levels. And as you can see, only 5 non-reference management plans were able to achieve both higher yields and higher biomass than the 2018 levels. But just looking at the endpoint of the simulation like this does not really give a full representation of the picture. This can be shown best by a comparison of the iSlope management plans and the ICES management plans. So on this graph, it looks that the iSlopes improve the yield slightly, but if you break down the total allowable catch given out by the model year on year, you can see the iSlopes down here and the 3 ICES up here, and the ICES management plans perform better for the majority of years. Interestingly as well, in this plot, you can see the current management plan in pink here, ICES category 3 based on an index of vulnerable abundance. But if you switch that to an index of spawning abundance, you can actually increase the yield quite substantially in some years. So moving on, of the 34 management plans tested, 11 met the criteria set out in the pressure state response framework. Also included in this graph are the current management plan, which missed out in the criteria narrowly, also a no fishing reference and an FMSY reference. So overall, the ICES management plans scored the best in the relieving pressure on the system, stabilizing the state of the stock, and limiting the variation in response, but they scored really poorly in the socioeconomic category or the yields category. In comparison to this, came up with the delay difference models. They scored much more strongly in the economic categories, but this was traded off with a bit of an increased risk to the state of the stock and the pressure. The highest scoring one in the economic categories was the length-based spawning per recruit measure, and but this was, the trade-off here was a much greater reduction in the response and the state of the stock. So if we focus in on these a bit, and we look at the individual simulations and their evolution over time, so each line here represents one of the 1,000 simulations conducted. What's quite interesting here, first off, is that it kind of indicates that the ICES management plans are indeed founded in the precautionary approach. As the biomass here increases, so does the catch to an extent, but then as the biomass begins to plateau, the yields or the catches actually decline, showing that it's quite a conservative management plan. Another thing to highlight here is that both the length-based spawning per recruit and delay difference, they're associated with an increased risk to the biomass of the stock. However, this risk manifests in different ways. So in the length-based spawning per recruit, we see a more gradual but consistent decline, whereas with the delay difference models, we're seeing an overall trend positively, but a lot of the individual simulations are collapsing. And through sensitivity analysis, we can perhaps find out what's happening with the delay difference model. And so we looked at this with the robustness scenarios, and in the scenario where we reduced the error completely in the observation model, these individual simulation collapses stopped happening. And then also we see something interesting with the value of information plots. So these are the variables in the observation model that were most correlated with the ratio of fishing mortality to FMSY. And this one, the hyperstability to hyperdepletion in the index, as you move from a hyperstable stock to a hyperdepleted stock, you see a slight increase in the severity of the outliers. As for the ICES management plans, they're, the variables they were most sensitive to were fairly predictable. It was error in the index and the catch bias. So onto the discussion. And so firstly, the evaluation of the current ICES management plan. The long-term performance of the ICES management plan was comparable with that of the iSlope management plans, and the iSlope results actually support previous work done by Carruthers in 2015, showing that it's effective at rebuilding the stock. However, I think this work highlights the restrictive nature in the short to medium time frame for the iSlope measures. And this is ultimately what led to their failure within the pressure state response criteria. However, I do feel that they have potential as a backup for when continued declines are seen through using the ICES measures. One surprising result was the spawning stock. Using a spawning stock index improved the catches over a vulnerable index, and perhaps this could go some way to mitigating the effects of Rhea clavata as a choke species due to the landing obligation. And finally, there were some contrasts with previous work done by Jardim, who also assessed the ICES Category 3 harvest control rule. However, because we focused more on Rhea clavata, we used a 2/5 rule for the index calculation rather than a 2/3 rule. And we also implemented these 20% buffers, which he did not, and that's why you see the staggering of the increases in TAC advice. And as for potential alternatives, there was no silver bullet that would perfectly balance conservation and exploitation, but this is to be expected when using generic management plans that are not fine-tuned to the stock. And this issue was also exacerbated by the high levels of depletion that were started with in the simulations. As for potential alternatives, though, I think the delayed difference represents a really interesting opportunity. Although it didn't perform as well as it could have in the state and the pressure categories, that was likely associated with these individual simulation of collapses that we showed were associated with the outliers. And so with a certain degree of fine-tuning, this has a lot of potential, in particular because the delay difference is uniquely suited to elasmobranch species, as the equation that founds the model allows for a time lag in the stock dynamic, and this is why we've seen it being used previously in assessment models for elasmobranches, in particular in Australia. Finally, we did compare some non-catch-based control measures. These included some size and some effort controls. On a whole, the effort control measures performed well. However, you have to question the feasibility of implementing an effort control for the non-target species, whilst the target species are still managed through catch controls. So that you'd have to switch the whole fishery over to effort if you wanted to implement these. Size restrictions are a bit more feasible to implement. However, none of the size restriction measures performed well in the study. So some of the limitations were the assumption of a single fleet. For example, in the summer months, there is a small target fishery for Rhea clavata, but the model doesn't allow for more than multiple fleets. Initially, at the start of the project, we tried to estimate natural mortality in a novel way, but there simply wasn't sufficient data to do this. So this is something that people could work on in the future. And future work should also focus on incorporating the ontogenic habitat shift seen in Rhea clavata, and some stakeholder engagement is also advised. So conclusions, the ICES management plans were shown to stabilize and potentially improve the biomass of Rhea clavata. Switching from an index of vulnerable biomass to an index of spawning biomass could increase catches with limited risk to the stock. As for alternatives, the delay different model appears the most interesting, but it has to be fine-tuned. And finally, I think this study shows the feasibility of the DLM toolkit for assessing management plans in elasmobranches, and a more wide-scale study covering different taxon groups could be really interesting. So thank you for listening, and thank you to everyone who helped with the project.